So we had quite a number of these ridiculous tiny netbooks on this channel. We took a look at that Acer Aspire 1 and then the Barbie Pink HP Mini, and the reason I enjoy playing with them is, they're just amusing, fun, and something you don't really see nowadays as far as form factor goes. And sure, you can get small laptops nowadays, some with impressive specs, but netbook as a category was pretty much replaced entirely by things like cheap Chromebooks and tablets. These guys were very popular around mid to late 2000s before the tablet market was kicked off by things like the iPad, and they were priced extremely competitively as compared to regular notebooks, like they were half the price, sometimes even a third of a price of a regular consumer notebook. They ranged in price anywhere from $300 to $500 depending on the configuration, and you might think that's a great deal for an entry-level laptop, and on the surface, it's hard to argue about that. They had great portability, decent keyboards, a small but usable trackpad, great selection of ports, and they were surprisingly expandable. On all the netbooks I have, you can easily upgrade the memory, storage, and the battery, and they have things like audio and video out, so you can hook them up to a larger monitor if you wanted to use this at your desk, like more traditionally. So you might ask, why didn't we just all use netbooks, and why did they die off so quickly? Well, it's the fact that they almost always use the very lowest end processors, the dreaded Intel Atom, which severely bottlenecked the performance. Graphics also sucked some major ass, and they were never designed to be used for any graphically intensive loads. They were primarily meant as internet machines, hence the name netbook. But as that net grew and became more complex over the years, these guys became more and more useless at doing that one thing they were supposed to be quote-unquote good at. So 18 years later, what are these guys even good for? Well, while trying them out, I found they were more like on par with older generations of laptops, perhaps something from the XP era, in some cases even worse than that. But I still like playing with them, or more precisely torturing them, pushing them, making them do things they don't really like doing. Yeah, sorry, that's disturbing. So I thought, why don't we take a look at the machine that kinda kicked off the whole netbook revolution, the granddaddy of these cheapo tiny laptops, the amusingly named Asus Eee PC. And even though it was one of the first of its breed, it actually is the smallest one I have, and when you look at this thing and actually hold it in your hands, it's pretty incredible. It's hard to believe it's not like a child's toy and that there's a real computer inside. In my thumbnail, I've shown this thing going in a hoodie pocket, and it does fit pretty good, but it's sort of like trying to jam a tablet in there, and you're not stuffing this down your jeans pockets, I don't think. Well, unless you have some sort of weird Gen Z pants or something. And again, I can't stress that enough. This thing really is awesome as far as expandability goes. You could hardly ask for more. We have 3 USB-A ports, audio in and out, Ethernet, an MMC or SD card reader, and a VGA out. Geez. On top of that, look at this. Turn this thing around, take out 4 screws, and bam! There's your hard drive and memory. And pop these 2 levers and your battery comes right out. So even if the performance sucks, there is actually something to be said about that classic mid-2000s notebook design. As far as where this thing came from, well, it was a classic story of me bidding on a bunch of crap at a local auction and winning this lot for around 15 bucks, which included this HP workstation, an HP desktop, a freaking Behringer mixer, car amplifier, and a bag full of knickknacks like new old stock DVD-RWs, which I can always use, some old controllers, tablets, a Dell docking station, some other crap, and this quirky little Asus notebook. Usually with lots like these, you never know what you're getting, but with this one, the guy actually showed the desktops powered on and sold the rest as untested. So when I got this thing home, I've tried hooking it up to my universal power supply, which has this handy display for dialing in your output voltage, and even though it feels like a cheap Chinese piece of crap, because it is, it actually does a decent job, and it's kinda accurate, although I do check it with my meter beforehand. Usually with these random notebooks I get from auctions or scrapyards, I use like a 19-volt laptop adapter, but this guy actually takes 9.5 volts, which is sort of unusual. Anyway, given where this thing came from, I was pretty amazed that it turned on just fine. and after a couple of moments it tried booting to Arch Linux, so even the hard drive was working. Now Linux was actually the operating system these Eee PCs shipped with, even though some also came with Windows XP pre-installed. And Linux was actually a fine choice for a computer of this class, since it was far leaner and less taxing on that poor CPU and graphics, and would surely help get the most out of the system with such limited system resources. Besides, even if users were completely new to the Linux experience, again, this notebook's key feature was not to install a bunch of programs and applications, but rather to get online. And for that, the only thing you needed really was a browser, again very similar to what Chromebooks do. Unfortunately, my installation of Linux was password protected, so I couldn't explore it in more detail, and before you run to your keyboard and start telling me how to bypass that password, there's really no need, because I wanted to try something else. I wanted to see what the Windows experience really was on these, and just how much power these guys have when it comes to early to mid 2000s gaming. It's one of those things where I know it's going to suck, but I just wanted to see it for myself. And we will also see what the general OS performance is like while we're at it. So let's have some fun, and before installing the OS on here, I wanted to see how much memory was in there, since I've read it takes up to 2 gigs of DDR2 RAM. And originally this thing came with either a hard drive or an SSD, which back in 2007 was quite a fresh concept, and they were much more expensive at the same storage capacity. So if you did get an SSD in your computer, it was usually much less in capacity. But I thought, since the hard drive is right here, why don't we take it out and swap it for a nice little SATA SSD, which will hopefully make this experience a bit more pleasant. So once the hardware has been refreshed, so to speak, it was time to get an OS on there, and I wanted to try Windows XP, since that was one of the operating systems originally shipping with it. And it also happens to be a nice little safe space for me, since that was the OS I used the most as a teen, and it brings me a weird feeling of joy anytime I use it, so hey, why not? And even though I've read that this thing was able to run Windows Vista or 7 as well, and I even found some drivers for it, I just felt I'd have a better chance with XP. And I know people have mixed feelings about Vista, but I was actually one of those people who used Vista around 2007. It was on my mom's work computer, and yeah, it sucked. It was very unstable, it had compatibility issues with some of the software that needed to be run for work purposes, and it was way more demanding and overall ran way worse, so we did actually downgrade to Windows XP Service Pack 3 at one point, I guess when that came out around 2009 or something. Anyway, since this thing doesn't have an optical drive, we're installing from a bootable USB here. And I think nowadays people have lost insight on how important optical media, and indeed the writers were in the 2000s. For one thing, we didn't always have flat rate internet, so you had to download things sparingly. But even when we did get flat rate, the download speeds were atrocious by today's standards. I remember thinking that 100 kilobytes per second was freaking awesome, so imagine downloading a whole DVD's worth of media. It used to take hours, heck, sometimes even days. So to be left without a way of loading and saving commercial software, I mean, that was a big deal, and I guess nothing would prevent you from hooking up an external writer, which is what we're going to do, but still, it just goes to show how these computers were not meant as primary machines, rather a second or a third one that you could take with you. A perfectly normal idea nowadays, but still pretty fresh around 2007. Anyway, with that SSD in place of the slower hard drive, this installation really did go quickly, especially since we piped it through that USB instead of the CD. And I was soon prompted to enter the activation key, which is a good time to talk about this video sponsor, Keysoff. And yeah, you might have noticed that I install a lot of operating systems and applications in my videos, probably every week, but there's no way in hell I'm paying hundreds of dollars for a freaking Windows license or Office package. And you also know that I like saving money and getting good deals, and sites like Keysoff enable you to get a legitimate product license at a very fair price. So if you're in the market for a Windows or Office license, head out to keysoff.com, and if you use my code SCH50 or SCH62, you'll get 50% off Windows licenses and 62% off Microsoft Office. And you'll of course find direct links in the video description. To Keysoff for helping me out a little with this video, and on with the show. Upon reaching the desktop, there were of course some things I had to sort out as far as drivers are concerned, and I did find an archive of 900 model driver pack on archive.org. Shout out to whoever put that up there, but yeah, there was a lot of Asus bloatware in that package, which I chose not to install, so I just took care of the graphics, chipset, audio, network, and a couple of other things. And yeah, after that it was time to see what this thing can do. And look, personally, when I put together computers like this, it's mostly because I just like to have fun with them, and I especially enjoy the opportunity to play around with an XP era machine because, as a game collector, I have a lot of games specifically from that era. But I'm not even going to attempt to install some of the later titles, and the main limiting factor is going to be that graphics chip, or lack thereof. Some of these games really require you to have a dedicated graphics card or a substantial amount of VRAM, which this thing just doesn't have. But surprisingly, if you temper your expectations a little bit, this thing almost impresses with some earlier, less demanding titles. And one positive thing about earlier DirectX 3D gaming is that there are a lot of great titles that run very well, even on under-equipped gear like this. And hey, 20 to 30 FPS on games like Vice City, Serious Sam 2, or Unreal Tournament, even if I've gotten this thing years after its release, say around 2012, I'd still be very happy to have a tiny PC to play these bangers on. I have connected my external Apple SuperDrive, for which I have installed an appropriate driver, in order to run my collection of physical discs. A word on input and output. This guy has a 8.9-inch matte display, and I really prefer that over the glossy one that was on Acer Aspire 1, and it's really not bad at all, especially when compared to what cheaper notebooks were shipping with 5 years before that. I mean, viewing angles are not great by today's standards, but it gets a pass for lower resolution gaming and just casual media consumption. Keyboard is ridiculous, even when compared to other netbooks I featured on this channel before. The keys are amusingly tiny, and even though it's not the worst feeling keyboard I ever tried, it's just expectedly mushy, and if you're a touch typer, yeah, you're going to have a bad time. I had issues trying to type with any amount of accuracy or speed, and even just casual gaming gave me issues, but I guess it's all part of the experience, and I do think I could get used to it, and it'd still be better than those chiclet keyboards or something. Trackpad is equally annoying, but usable. Buttons suck ass, and I didn't even attempt to game on it. I was quick to connect my Bluetooth mouse, and yeah, that made the experience a whole lot smoother. And once I was done with gaming, I figured I'd give web browsing a shot, and yeah, for XP machines I like to use MyPal, which is, to best of my knowledge, one of the few supported browsers for this OS, and it not only gets updates, but it handles modern sites quite well, like YouTube here. Sure, it barely runs it at 360p resolution, but come on, that's pretty awesome, and speakers don't sound half bad either. I mean, they do. They're harsh and tinny, but I guess I was expecting worse, so I'm praising it for no reason.
Thousands, they have 3 categories of notebooks. MacBook Pro, meant for professionals on the go. MacBook Air, a super slim model, but still pretty expensive.
So I think at this point I can publicly admit that I have somewhat of a fetish for these, and I just can't hate on them, even though they're objectively inferior to pretty much any laptop from this era, and honestly you'd be far better off doing any sort of stuff on just a regular Core 2 Duo Windows XP laptop from a similar time period. But there's just something about the form factor and the fact that it still manages to pull off a surprising number of tasks, despite the fact that it looks like a freaking kid's toy. And goddamn, with that little memory upgrade we did, along with the speedier SSD, I dare say the overall experience wasn't half bad at all. I mean, look at it, it literally looks like you pulled it from a Toys R Us shelf, and yet, look, we're running over hookers in Vice City at reasonable frame rate. And that's pretty awesome in my book. And I hope you enjoyed taking a look at this fun little class of computer from a slightly different time period. And if you owned one of these or a similar machine, let me know in the comments what was it like using it and what did you use it for. And if you had a machine like this nowadays, what would you do with it? What kind of OS and software would you run on it? And if you like watching me tinker with 2000s hardware, there's plenty of that here on my channel. I do videos like this twice a week, repairs, restorations, reviews, retrospectives, and so on. And if you'd like to support what I do, you can join my Patreon for just $1 a month, or more if you'd like. If you'd like to chat with me and other users, you can join our Discord server. All the links will be in the video description. Thanks, and I'll see you again soon. Cheers.